Last summer, just before the break, my friends A, B, and I were checking out the university bulletin board when we spotted a strange job flyer. The job offered a daily wage of 8,000 yen for a 4-day, 3-night stay at a villa in a summer resort, where we would be doing moving work. Meals and transportation costs were covered separately. I commented on how good the job sounded, and it said, "It looks like we'll be staying at the villa itself. Sounds easy. Let's give them a call." B, excited at the idea of getting paid to stay at a villa, agreed enthusiastically. Without thinking too much, we decided to call the number on the flyer. When we called, it turned out to be a management office for the villa area. Strangely enough, we were hired immediately without any interviews. In hindsight, we should have found that suspicious. The day of the job, we left early in the morning and arrived at the meeting point's nearest station before noon. A car was already waiting for us, and a man in his 40s who seemed friendly enough was inside. During the ride, he explained the details of the job. In short, there were 2 villas a bit away from the main resort area. Due to aging and poor location, the owner decided to demolish them, so we needed to move everything out. A truck would come every evening to pick up the items, but we would be handling all the work by ourselves. The truck would also bring food, so we didn't have to worry about meals. Both villas still had electricity, gas, and water, though cell phone signals didn't reach. There was a landline phone, so it wouldn't be too inconvenient. As for sleeping arrangements, we were told we could sleep in any room, but considering we'd be moving stuff later, he suggested staying near the entrance. Thinking back now, that pretty much isolated us, but we were too naive to realize it at the time. When we arrived at the villas, the 3 of us were taken aback. We had been told the villas were old, but they were far more run down than expected. Both were large log cabin-style houses, but the wooden walls were blackened, and moss grew in places where sunlight didn't reach. The yard looked like it had been neglected for years, with overgrown weeds, dying plants, and vines climbing everywhere. As we stood there in shock, the man said, "Well, the outside might look rough, but the inside's pretty clean," and led us into the nearer villa. Indeed, the interior was in much better shape. It seemed like some cleaning had already been done. There were shelves and cardboard boxes stacked in the entryway, but aside from that, it looked like a normal house. He then gave us a quick tour and explained our tasks. The second villa, however, had a different vibe. The moment we stepped in, it smelled musty, and there was a strange sense of gloom. The man didn't seem bothered, though, and continued explaining. Finally, while looking toward the back of the first-floor hallway, he added, "You don't need to bother with that area. There was a leak, and the floor's weakened. It's dangerous. Besides, there's not much left to move back there, and it's going to be demolished anyway." I figured the musty smell was probably due to the leak, and we all nodded in understanding. After the explanation, the man handed us his business card, said, "Take care," and left. Since it was already afternoon, we started our first day of work by moving the second-floor items from the villa we were shown first. By evening, a different man arrived with a truck, and we loaded it up, finishing our work for the day. We had no intention of sleeping in the musty villa, so we decided to stay in the living room of the one we had worked on. After dinner and a bath, we were so tired that we fell asleep early. The next morning, as we ate breakfast, B said something strange. "Did you guys hear a weird noise last night?" "Huh? What kind of noise?" I asked. "Well, I woke up in the middle of the night to go to the bathroom, and I heard this weird dragging sound coming from outside. It freaked me out. I thought B was just trying to scare us and laughed it off, but he insisted with a serious expression. I'm not lying. I really heard it." His tone caught me off guard. I then suggested, maybe we should check the area around the villa before starting today's work. After finishing breakfast, we took A's suggestion and decided to explore the surroundings. There were places where the overgrown weeds made it hard to walk, but we didn't find anything strange. We eventually concluded that B had probably heard an animal walking around. That day, we managed to finish clearing out the second villa earlier than expected, completing all the work by the end of the day. And then, that night, as I was sleeping, B, who was sleeping next to me, woke me up. Apparently, B had woken up too. Sounding annoyed, said, What are you doing waking me up in the middle of the night? B, in a low voice, responded, listen carefully and hear what's going on outside. While wondering what this was all about, A and I strained our ears. We could hear something being dragged across the ground. A and I exchanged looks, and I asked B, what the heck is that? B replied, how should I know? That's why I told you to listen. It was too regular to be an animal, and besides, I couldn't imagine any animal that would make that kind of sound. I started to feel a little scared, but I suggested to A and B, should we check outside from the window? A and B were also scared, but we were all curious about the source of the sound. So the three of us moved to the window and slightly pulled the curtain back to take a look outside. In the dim moonlight, we saw something by the entrance of the other building. It was hard to make out what it was because the light was so faint, but it was about 1 meter tall, about the size of a child. It swayed as it dragged something dark behind it. We stared at it in silence, unable to speak. Then it dragged the dark object and disappeared into the shadow of the building. After it completely disappeared, a few minutes passed before it finally broke the silence, saying, what the hell was that? I asked. Was it a person? B, however, said, a person that small? Could it be a child? But what would a child be doing out here in the mountains, in the middle of the night? That's impossible. He was right. But then what was it? I suggested, should we go check it out? But I, completely terrified, quickly said, no way. We'll be cleaning up that building tomorrow anyway. So we can check then. I blurted this out quickly, and A and B, both equally scared, agreed. We decided to force ourselves to go back to sleep. The next morning, our feet felt heavy, and it wasn't just from exhaustion. Even so, we couldn't avoid checking out what we saw last night. So, armed with some sticks we found nearby, we cautiously started poking through the bushes near the spot where we saw the thing. After a while checking the bushes behind the villa, my stick hit something soft. I called over A and B, saying, hey, there's something over here. We cleared the bushes and found something that looked like a black, sludge-like substance. It wasn't just in one spot either. It was scattered here and there. As we followed the trail, we found the black stuff was even stuck to the back wall of the villa. We followed the trail even further, and it seemed to lead to underneath the villa's porch. But beyond that, there was nothing more. We even checked under the porch, but other than some of the same black stuff near the entrance, it didn't go deeper. Feeling a little let down, we continued with our packing work, leaving the creepy atmosphere behind us. By the afternoon, we had cleared most of the second floor, and as B and I were talking about taking a break, F, who was on the first floor, called out to us, come down here for a sec. When we went down to the first floor, it was standing near the leaky hallway where the floor had rotted. He motioned for us to come over. B asked, what is it? Did you find something? Looking serious, replied, I hear a rustling noise coming from beyond this hallway. Could it be connected to what we saw last night? I got a chill, but not wanting to show that I was scared, I said, all right, let's check it out. Though I really didn't want to go. As we started walking toward the back of the hallway, we could hear the rustling noise clearly. We all froze for a second. B, with obvious uncertainty, said, maybe some animal got in, but a part of me wanted to find out what it was. So, gathering our courage, the three of us ventured further down the dim hallway. The floor creaked under our feet, probably weakened by the moisture. The rustling sound from the back didn't stop either. Mustering up our courage, we continued until we found the source of the noise. A cat, bleeding heavily from its stomach. It was still alive, barely moving, and every time it did, its paws scraped against the floor, making the rustling noise. The moment we saw it, we screamed and ran out of the villa. After calming down outside, I muttered, that cat. It's probably dead by now, right? But why was it in there? I added, how did a cat with such a serious injury end up in that hallway? It doesn't make any sense. B suggested, maybe we should go check on it again? It was true that we couldn't just leave it like that. So we headed back to the hallway. But when we got there, the cat was gone. There was a stain where the blood had pooled, but even the blood that had been gushing out was gone. We all exchanged puzzled looks and searched the area, but the cat was nowhere to be found. There was a locked door at the end of the hallway, but it didn't budge, and we didn't think the cat could be behind it. So we decided to let it go for now and return to our work. Even though we were creeped out and couldn't figure out what was going on, we still had work to do, and the sun was getting higher in the sky. So, to distract ourselves, we resumed packing up the villa's belongings. During lunch, B quietly said, "Maybe the reason we got this job so easily, with no interview and great pay, is because of all this weird stuff happening here." And he was right. I then suggested, "Why don't we finish today's work and then leave with our pay?" But I pointed out, we have a contract for a 4-day job, don't we? What if they refuse to pay us if we don't finish? Besides, it wouldn't make sense to tell them we want to leave because we saw some weird stuff. We haven't been harmed or anything. A and B agreed, and we decided to focus on finishing the work as quickly as possible. We also planned to ask the truck driver about any strange occurrences when he arrived. As evening approached, we were desperate to leave the place quickly, so we worked hard and managed to move almost all the items out of the second house that same day. When the truck arrived, we subtly asked the man driving if he had noticed anything strange around here, but it seemed like he was just there because he was asked to be, and didn't really know much about the place. In the end, we didn't get any useful information and had to face the final night. Looking back, we should have just called the number on the business card we were given. And that night, the incident happened. One night, while A and I were playing games in the living room, B, who had been in the bath, came rushing out, saying, "Hey, something's wrong. That noise is back again." It was around 10 p.m. According to B, as he was getting dressed after the bath, he heard the same noise from the window in the dressing room as he had the previous night, and he hurriedly came running to us in a panic. Determined to figure out what the noise was, we grabbed a flashlight from the entrance and headed outside. Of course, we were scared, but since nothing had actually happened yet, our curiosity outweighed our fear. But this was our mistake. When we stepped outside, we saw something about a meter in size moving, just like the night before. As I pointed the flashlight toward it, the figure slipped into the neighboring villa and disappeared. We approached where it had gone and found the front door of the villa wide open, despite the fact that we had locked it. We couldn't just leave it like that, and since we knew we had locked the door, we decided we had to check inside. After exchanging glances, the three of us stepped into the villa. Inside, the place already had a musty smell, but now, there was an additional, strange, fishy odor in the air. As I was looking for the light switch in the hallway, I noticed something strange. Above the shoe rack by the entrance, there was a square section of the wall where a talisman had been stuck, though I hadn't seen it before. I looked more closely after turning on the light and realized that there were more talismans plastered on the ceiling of the hallway. B, and I exchanged glances, thinking, so that's what this is about. Just then, we heard a door creak open from the room at the far end of the hallway, where we had previously found the dying cat. The only door down there was the one that had been locked and wouldn't open before. Then, from around the corner of the hallway, came a dragging, squelching sound, like something was being pulled along the floor. We were frozen in fear, unable to move or even speak, when suddenly, something peeked around the corner of the hallway. We held our breath. It was the head of a traditional Japanese doll, about the size of a child, staring at us with an expressionless face. I let out a soundless gasp and began to back away. A and B did the same, backing away in terror at the eerie sight. The doll's head then retreated around the corner, and the rest of its body emerged. The sight was so grotesque it sent shivers down my spine. The doll's upper body was that of a large traditional Japanese doll wearing a kimono, but its lower body was buried in a black, sticky, tar-like substance that it seemed to be dragging along. The black sludge trailing behind it was exactly the same thing we had seen during the day. The doll continued to advance toward us, and as it got closer, the fishy stench in the air became stronger. We backed out of the house and into the yard, but that's when I noticed something odd. At first, I was too panicked to realize, but the doll was approaching us while singing. The tune sounded like an old traditional handball song, but as I listened more carefully, It also resembled a Buddhist chant. It was an eerie and unsettling melody. Even though it was singing so close to us, I couldn't make out the lyrics. As we backed away down the path, B suddenly pointed toward the forest and shouted, "Oh no! Look at the woods!" A and I turned to see the bushes rustling all around. It was as if a large number of something was approaching us, and the rustling sounds were growing more numerous. To make matters worse, the eerie song that the doll was singing began to echo from multiple directions. I yelled, "We need to run!" And we all took off at full speed down the road. We must have run for about a kilometer, sprinting until we were completely out of breath. Finally, a gasped for us to stop and we collapsed to the ground. Catching his breath, I said, "We ran, but what are we going to do? All our stuff is still back there." B, equally out of breath, added, "Yeah, we panicked and ran, but what now?" I asked, "Are we seriously going back there?" Both of them shook their heads in silence. At that moment, we heard the singing again, coming from the direction of the forest. B, now pale with fear, shouted, "They're following us." Even though we were exhausted, we couldn't stay there. Once again, we ran down the pitch-black mountain road as fast as we could. I have no idea how long we ran, but eventually we found what looked like a drive-in rest area. It was closed, of course, but just seeing a building made us feel a bit safer. Then, I checked my phone and saw that I finally had a signal. I quickly dialed the number on the business card we were given, but of course, at this hour, no one answered. I started making a phone call on his cell phone. He was talking to someone for a while, and eventually, he said weakly, "They're coming for us." When I asked who he called, it turned out he had contacted the police. For the next 30 minutes, we were on edge, terrified that the doll might start chasing us again, or that we might hear that haunting singing. Eventually, a patrol car with flashing lights pulled up. When I saw the police car, I was so relieved that I collapsed to the ground before I could even think about how to explain everything. Felt like all the tension had drained out of me. We were put in the patrol car and driven to a nearby business hotel. On the way, we explained what had happened, but of course they didn't believe a word of it. In the end, they brushed it off as a mere misunderstanding. I guess it couldn't be helped. After the police dropped us off in front of the hotel and we thanked them, we suddenly realized something important. We had left our wallets at the villa. In the end, we had no choice but to sleep in a nearby park until the sun came up. The next morning, I called the number on the business card and, rather angrily, explained what had happened. The man who had first picked us up at the station sounded alarmed and rushed over to the park to pick us up. As he drove, he apologized profusely. "I'm really sorry. I should have explained everything properly. I'll tell you the whole story once we get to the office." When we arrived at the office, we were told that someone had already gone to retrieve our belongings from the villa and would return with them in about 20 minutes. Then the man started explaining the situation. As expected, those two villas had been abandoned by their owners after strange things started happening involving that Japanese doll. They had decided to demolish the place, and as they began moving things out, strange phenomena started occurring one after another. Word spread quickly, and soon, no one from the nearby area wanted anything to do with the property. This all happened about a year ago. With no other options, they consulted a nearby temple and spent quite a bit of money on a purification ritual. After that, they thought the problem had been solved and put up job postings at universities far from the area, which is how we got involved. In short, we fell right into their trap. The man went on to explain that, at first, strange events and sightings of the doll had occurred both day and night. But after the purification, they noticed nothing happened during the day, so they convinced themselves it was safe. And that led to what happened to us. The man was genuinely remorseful, and he insisted on paying us for all 4 days of work, as well as reimbursing our travel expenses on the spot. He was so apologetic that we no longer felt any anger. In the end, we took our 4 days of wages and the money for travel and decided to head home. Before leaving, I asked the man one last question. "So, what exactly is that doll?" To which he replied, "I don't know either." 3 years ago, I was working part-time at a delivery center for a certain company. The first floor was the truck loading area. Half of the second floor was offices, while the other half was for packing goods. The third through fifth floors were used as storage. I worked in the office on the second floor, handling administrative tasks. One hot summer day, I had to work overtime because I couldn't finish my work on time. It was just me and Sada-san left in the office. Sada-san was 35 at the time, a plain woman who never wore makeup. She once said out of nowhere, "Spirits of the living are scarier than the dead." You know? She was kind, but there was always something mysterious about her. Even after 8 p.m., I still had a lot of work left to do. It was usually noisy in the office, so I found it strange that everything felt unusually quiet. Sada-san was silently going about her work. There were no sounds of cars or even insects. The sudden silence began to scare me, so I decided to break it by talking to Sada-san. But just as I opened my mouth, a loud noise reverberated throughout the office. I jumped up in surprise, and then the same noise echoed again. It seemed like someone was pushing a cart vigorously around the third floor. I immediately thought it must be a burglar. "We should call the police and get out of here," I shouted. There was no way the two of us could handle a burglar. But when I looked at Sada-san, she had her eyes closed and was muttering something quietly. "What are you doing? We need to leave now," I urged her. She snapped back at me, "Be quiet. Stay silent. That is not a person." I tried to respond, but for some reason, no sound came out of my mouth. Then, just as suddenly as the noise started, silence fell over the office again. But this time, there was a different sound. The large freight elevator was moving. From the office, I could see the elevator. It was stopped on the third floor, but now the down arrow was lit. Goosebumps erupted all over my body, and I tried to run, but my body wouldn't move. Something was in that elevator. It was coming here. A loud noise signaled that it had stopped on the second floor, and the doors opened. At that moment, Sada-san shouted something forcefully, and I suddenly regained control of my body. I quickly covered my ears and curled up on the floor. Sada-san was shouting something desperately, but I couldn't make out the words. All I felt was pure terror. I couldn't do anything but tremble, screaming for help inside my head. Then, out of nowhere, something yanked on my hair. A voice, a man's voice, something between a sob and a laugh, whispered right next to my ear, and I lost consciousness. When I came to, Sada-san was waking me up, saying, "It's okay now. Let's go home." We quickly left the building. The strange thing was that by the time I got home, it was already past midnight. According to Sada-san, I had only been unconscious for about 5 minutes. It felt like the incident happened around 9 p.m., but somehow it was much later. 3 days later, when I met Sada-san again, her entire right side was covered in a bright red rash. "Don't worry about it," she said with a smile, but I couldn't help wondering, what exactly was that thing? The experience was too terrifying for me to bring it up again, and soon after, I quit the company. Sada-san moved to Kyushu because her husband got transferred. Only she knows what was inside that elevator. Even though I'm not spiritually sensitive, I could feel the presence of something unknown that night. I only heard the sound and the voice, but that voice still lingers in my mind to this day. I have a strange friend. She's a girl, but how should I describe her? There's just something mysterious about her. She's pretty cute, so at first, I wanted to date her, but somehow the mood never felt right, and before I knew it, we were just regular friends. Last November, when she came over to my apartment, we were playing games at first, but eventually got bored and started watching TV. There wasn't anything particularly interesting on, and we were both just zoning out when she suddenly said, almost to herself, "Oh, this person too." I don't watch TV much, so I had no idea what she was talking about. Apparently, she was referring to some young comedian on the screen. I asked, "What about them?" At first, she brushed it off, saying, "Oh, it's nothing." and laughed it away. But I was bored and looking for something to talk about, so I pressed her on it. Reluctantly, she began telling me a strange story. She said, "This might make me seem weird, but ever since I was a kid, I've been able to see strange things about certain people. It didn't happen often when I was younger, but recently, I've been seeing these things more frequently. And I saw one with that guy just now." I didn't get what she meant, so I asked, "Is it like having some kind of sixth sense or something?" She hesitated, replying, "Maybe. I've never seen ghosts or anything, though. To be honest, I wasn't really that interested, but since we were already talking about it, I kept asking her for more details." She explained that it wasn't like seeing human shapes or black shadows, like the typical supernatural stuff people talk about. Instead, sometimes she sees something like a tree growing out of people's backs. When she got to that part, she suddenly stopped, as if realizing she had said too much, and laughed nervously. "You don't have to believe me. Just forget I said anything." She quickly changed the subject, suggesting we call some friends and go out for dinner. The mood made it pretty clear she didn't want me to ask anything more, so I let it go. We called up some friends, went to a family restaurant, and after eating we were chatting outside about what to do next. Someone suggested karaoke. As we were talking, she glanced toward a crowded street and quietly muttered, "Oh." It was loud enough that everyone turned to look. Just then, a well-dressed businessman walking nearby suddenly stumbled and collapsed right there in the street. There was a commotion, and someone called an ambulance, which took him away. One of the other girls, who seemed to know more about the situation, turned to her and said, "You saw it again, didn't you? Don't worry, it's not your fault." But my friend still looked sad. The atmosphere was heavy, so no one asked her about it, and we went to karaoke as planned before heading home. The next week, while I was sitting on a bench near the university reading manga, she and the friend who comforted her before came over and asked if they could talk to me. I didn't have anything else to do, so I said sure. They wanted to change locations, so we went to a nearby cafe. They both looked serious, and after a while, the other friend started talking. Because I had heard about the tree thing, they figured I deserved to know the full story. Apparently, since she was a child, my friend has been able to see trees growing out of certain people. At first, she told her parents about it, but they didn't take her seriously. Not wanting to be thought of as weird, she kept it a secret for years. Eventually, though, she noticed that the people she saw with trees growing out of them often had some sort of problem. She couldn't bear the burden alone anymore, so she began confiding in a few friends. Even though she really wanted to tell her parents, her experience of being dismissed as a child kept her from doing so. Only her closest friends know about it. Apparently, she never intended to tell me, but because I pressed her when she let it slip, she and her other friend decided to explain everything to me. Up to that point, it was just a weird story, but what they told me next was the real problem. The key points are fourfold. First, this tree seems to grow little by little, much like an ordinary tree, gradually becoming larger and branching out. Eventually, it can grow to be several meters tall. She has watched many people with this tree growing on them over the years, and while the timeline varies for different people, it apparently takes a few years for the tree to grow from a small sapling to a full-sized tree. The problem arises from this point. Once the tree reaches its full size, it withers. Some people reach this withered state in a few years, while others remain around 1 meter in height for many years, showing that there is considerable individual variation. When the tree reaches its withered state, terrible misfortune befalls the person it is growing from. She hasn't seen every case, but within her knowledge, these misfortunes include serious illnesses, severe injuries with lasting aftereffects, involvement in traffic accidents leading to massive compensation payments, family breakdowns, and in the worst cases, death from accidents, illness, or even suicide. It never ends well. The second point, which shocked her, is that until now, all the people she had seen with the tree growing on them were basically strangers, people she had little or no connection with. However, a customer at her part-time job, with whom she had become quite friendly, recently started showing signs of the tree growing on them. She was very shocked that someone she knew personally now had the tree growing on them. Although she can see the tree, she can't touch it, and once it starts growing, there's nothing she can do. She's resigned to the fact that there's no way to help this friendly customer. She looked like she was about to cry as she said that even if she told them, they probably wouldn't believe her. The third point, which was particularly significant for me, is that for some reason, when she tells the story to others, not everyone, but some people start seeing the trees as well. For example, her close female friend who was with us didn't start seeing the trees after hearing the story, but a middle school friend of hers and her high school boyfriend did. Her boyfriend even distanced himself and eventually broke up with her because of it. When I heard that, I laughed and asked, "Why are you telling me this then?" But inside I was really panicking. The female friend scolded me, saying, "Well, it's your fault for pushing her to tell the story. You brought this on yourself." Even though it felt unfair, I couldn't argue further. She told me that since I had already heard part of the story, she felt it was important to prepare me mentally, just in case. Normally, I wouldn't believe such a story, but I had no choice after the incident in front of the family restaurant. The fourth point, which is also quite concerning, is that she said ever since the start of this month, she has noticed more and more people on TV, like celebrities and news anchors, who seem to have the tree growing on them. That's what she meant when she said she's been seeing it more often recently. According to her, it seems like these people all started developing the tree around the same time, which is unsettling. What's even more concerning is that, although she doesn't know why, all the trees she sees on television are completely black, unlike the normal trees she's seen before. These are the key points from the conversation between her and the female friend. After hearing all of this, I wanted to ask them something, so I turned to her and asked, "If telling someone about it can make them start seeing the trees, shouldn't you tell that customer of yours? If they start seeing it, they might finally believe you." Her female friend immediately replied, "That's a gamble, though, and besides, how could you tell someone they're doomed to misfortune?" She also sadly said that telling the customer wouldn't solve anything. I had to agree. Even if I had a tree growing on me and was told the same thing, I wouldn't know what to do. I'd probably think it was a lie, and if I did start seeing it, it would feel like a countdown to my death. There's no way I'd stay calm. I felt bad for asking such a thoughtless question and apologized to her. Apparently, normally when she goes to crowded places like Shinjuku Station or Tokyo Station, she might see 2 or 3 people with trees growing on them. However, when she watches TV now, she always sees at least one person in every show. It's an unusually high number. Something big has definitely changed recently, but neither she, her friend, nor I have any idea what it means. She doesn't even know why it's a tree or why she can see them, let alone why other people start seeing them after she tells the story. I felt sorry for her, having had to see this for so many years, and I admired her for being able to stay cheerful despite her circumstances. I still hang out with her often, and she told me that for those who do start seeing the trees, it typically happens within a year of hearing the story. If I can't see anything by November this year, then I should be in the clear. By the way, it seems that unless she directly tells the story, people don't start seeing the trees, so no one should worry about becoming able to see them just by reading this account. One time when I was with her, she pointed out a person to me, telling me that they had a tree growing on them. Shortly after, that person was hit by a car and thrown through the air. Their leg bent in the opposite direction at the knee, and they stopped moving completely. It was a shocking sight, and it made me seriously consider the possibility that I might need to mentally prepare myself in case I start seeing these trees too. I realized something then, and I asked her, "I get that things get bad when the tree withers, but how can you tell exactly when that happens?" She answered, "When the time comes, the withered tree breaks, so you'll know." That's the end of my story. She's given me permission to share it here. As for the people she saw with trees growing on TV, their numbers were increasing gradually until recently, but now it seems like they've stopped. I told her, "Maybe you should stop watching TV." She replied, "Yeah, I think I will," but I don't know if she ever actually stopped watching. This is a story from when my dad was younger. After securing a job, he rented a brand new apartment. He borrowed a truck from the lumber shop he worked part-time at and asked one of his juniors to help him move from the shabby apartment he'd been living in. There wasn't much to move, so the unpacking didn't take too long. However, his junior had been pale and visibly unwell since they arrived at the apartment, so my dad gave him his payment and sent him home early. That night, exhausted from the move, my dad went to bed early. But in the middle of the night, he was awakened by the sound of a faint, whispering voice. At the time, he was the first tenant to move in, and no one else was living in the neighboring units, so it couldn't have been a neighbor. He turned on the lights and looked out the window, but all he saw was the quiet stillness of a suburban street at night. No drunks wandering about, no late-night activity at all. Convinced it was just his imagination, he went back to bed. But just as he was about to drift off, the whispering started again. At first, he thought it might be the wind or some creaking of the building that sounded like voices, but he soon realized it was coming from inside the building itself. Thinking maybe some clumsy burglar had broken into one of the empty units next door, he pressed his ear to the wall and listened carefully. Nothing. Not a single sound. No sign of human presence. He dismissed it as his imagination and decided to sleep. But just as he was about to doze off again, he heard whispering from the opposite side, right in his ear. He turned around quickly, but of course no one was there. Growing increasingly frustrated, my dad decided to investigate. He knocked on the doors of every apartment in the building, both on his floor and the one above, but no one answered. As expected, he was still the only resident in the building. Exhausted, he returned to his room, and that's when he saw it. A terrifying sight. A white hand was slowly emerging from the drain in the kitchen sink. It looked as though it was about to crawl out entirely. He almost screamed and ran, but he held his ground. As he watched, the hand groped around the kitchen, as if searching for something, before retreating back into the drain. The moment it disappeared, my dad was drenched in cold sweat. But he thought to himself, if I run now, I lose. Determined, he stormed over to the sink, turned on the tap, and blasted water into the drain. Obviously, no human could fit into a drain pipe, so nothing unusual happened. He checked the cupboard under the sink, and as expected, found nothing. He started to wonder if he'd just seen a ghost. It didn't feel like a hallucination, and there was that unmistakable feeling of dread in the air. He thought back to all the strange things he'd seen as a child, all the times he'd been scared. Could he really just run away? He wondered if the security deposit would be refunded if he left early. No, he decided this was something he had to face. So, he leaned down close to the drain and yelled, "Don't you dare come out again. If I die, I'll come back and haunt you." After that, he felt better and went back to bed, thinking how ridiculous the whole situation was. Ghosts can't kill me, he thought. I won't lose to something like that. The next morning, nothing unusual happened. He returned the truck to the lumber shop, where he found his junior from the previous day, still looking pale and anxious. Curious, my dad asked what had happened. I felt something really unsettling the moment I walked into your apartment, the junior said. When I looked toward the kitchen, I saw a white hand coming out of the sink. I've seen strange things before, but that was the creepiest one yet. I didn't say anything because I didn't want to ruin your mood in the new place. My dad laughed. Maybe his threat had worked because after that, nothing strange happened in the apartment. He lived there for about 2 years before being transferred to a different city. On the day he moved out, he felt a strange presence behind him as he left the apartment for the last time. Half out of curiosity and half out of dread, he turned around, and there it was, the same white hand, waving at him from the kitchen sink. As surreal as it was, my dad waved back. Of course, he swears that part was made up. But honestly, knowing my dad, I wouldn't be surprised if it were true. I once had a part-time job inspecting drainage pipes. The job involved going underground to check for any irregularities. Felt like a bit of an adventure, and I was always excited to work. When I first started, one of the senior workers told me, "You might see people in the drainage pipes, so be careful. If you do see someone, call out to them. But if they don't say anything and just run away, never chase them." After a few shifts, I realized that there were some drainage pipes where people could actually live, and sometimes we'd encounter homeless people. The homeless themselves weren't really dangerous, but looking back, the job was risky in more ways than one. Once you went about 10 meters into the pipe, it became pitch black, and honestly, it was pretty terrifying from a paranormal perspective too. I remember once seeing an entire wall covered in what looked like a prayer chant or sutras, and that definitely sent chills down my spine. But despite the dangers, I enjoyed the job. One day, I was assigned to enter a horizontal shaft by a river. These types of pipes sometimes led to places where several drainage lines converged, and if you were lucky, you'd see huge waterfalls created by the flowing water. It was a breathtaking sight, and I was eager to get to that point. I ventured in, and after about 20 meters, I spotted what looked like a human figure in the distance. "Hey, what are you doing there?" I called out, but there was no response. It wasn't a place where people could easily enter, and the area could flood if the water level rose. At first, I thought I might be seeing trash or debris, but it looked too much like a person. Maybe they were up to no good? Determined to find out, I moved closer, and the figure seemed to shift slightly. "Hey, it's dangerous. Get out of there." I yelled again, but instead of responding, the figure started to retreat further into the pipe. As they moved, I heard a strange metallic clanging noise, like they were hitting the walls with something. I had grown confident in the job by then, so I decided to follow. I chased the figure down the pipe, but before I knew it, I was right at the edge of the convergence point, dangerously close to falling into the water below. Worse still, the person had vanished. All I could hear were the sounds of rushing water and that eerie metallic noise echoing around me. Panicked, I ran back to the entrance and told the senior worker who was standing guard. He scolded me. "I told you not to chase them." It turns out several people had seen similar figures in the pipes, and it was a well-known story in our industry. I got so scared of going down the drain after that I stopped.